Maybe you've had someone tell you as you were sharing your faith with them, and they've said, God is evil. I've had people say this to me as the reason why they do not believe and cannot believe or take the Bible seriously. And their reasoning for saying this is due in some part to the things that happen in Joshua. The first city that's captured in Joshua is the city of Jericho. And when the walls came crashing down, the Israelites were commanded to kill everyone, men, women, and young and old. Okay, and I would not be speaking honestly if I said that I found this easy to accept, because I don't. Because it means that, yes, they killed children. Now, maybe you find that troubling as well. Now, we've already seen a lot of this already in our readings. Through Genesis through Deuteronomy, there are examples of this very thing happening. And this will not be the last time we encounter something like this, with this issue of God commanding his people to do what many would just simply call genocide. How are we to understand this differently than when we see genocide take place in our own day? How should we understand the conquest of Canaan and the killing of so many people, including children? Well, I wanted to share a few things that I think will be helpful to you, which I found helpful. And a lot of this has to do with not really understanding what's going on in the conquest. We must first understand Canaan itself. What is the significance of the land of Canaan? This will really help us, I think, understand the conquest. The first time we hear of this land that Joshua is conquering is when God called Abraham from Ur of the Chaldeans to a new land that he said he was going to give to him and to his descendants. Now, this land is significant. There's something special about this land, but what is it? Well, Canaan is really where it all began. You see, Canaan is the primeval land of Eden. This is where Eden was located. Now, I know you might be sitting there thinking, wow, I've never heard that before. This is a little bit of a shocker, especially when so many scholars are all in agreement that Eden was probably somewhere in modern-day Iraq, in Mesopotamia. And a lot of times this is believed because of the locations of the two rivers that are mentioned. There's really four rivers mentioned, and I'll get to that in a minute. But two of the rivers, Tigris and Euphrates, still bear those names. But remember, though, there was a global flood, and there were other things that have changed the landscape since then. So you can't really look at a modern-day map and make sense of it based on what it says there in Genesis, because things have changed. The landscape has changed. So they don't look as they're described in Genesis 2. However, one of my professors that I had in seminary, Dr. Richard Pratt, points out that there's quite a bit of biblical evidence to support this perspective. In fact, he is really the one that introduced me to this idea, and I think makes a lot of sense. And so I'm just sort of passing this idea along. The rivers themselves should be understood to mark the boundaries of Eden. He says that according to Genesis 2:10, Moses mentioned, and I'm quoting Pratt now, Moses mentioned the Tigris and Euphrates to provide general orientation toward the easternmost extent of Eden. The great rivers in the east marked the eastern boundary region of Eden. This outlook is confirmed by the locations of the other rivers mentioned in Genesis 2. In Genesis 2:11, and also in verse 13, Moses mentioned another pair of rivers. He wrote that the river of Eden fed the Pison, which winds through Havilah, and it also fed the Gihon, which winds through the entire land of Cush. Now, in the Old Testament, the lands of Havilah and Cush are often associated with the region of Egypt. We cannot be sure precisely how Moses understood these rivers in relation to the Great Nile River, but it is safe to say that he pointed to the region of northern Egypt as the western border of Eden. You also have to kind of remember that east and west were sort of the way that the maps were oriented. They thought in terms of east, not in terms of north, like we do today. So we can see, though, in Moses' outlook, that Eden was no small place. It was a large area extending from the Tigris-Euphrates to the border of Egypt, nearly all the region that we now call today the Fertile Crescent. So think about that. Consider also the borders of the land that God had said he would give to Abraham's descendants. In Genesis 15:18, he says, "To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." So the borders resemble the borders mentioned in Genesis 2. But of course, that's not enough, right? There are more things to consider. Richard Pratt also states that the primary way in which Moses conveyed the holiness of Eden was to describe it in terms that he also used to describe the tabernacle. I'll leave that to you to research a little more in depth. But think about this. Eden was the place where God and man walked together and had fellowship. And the tabernacle was designed to be the very same thing. It was, as was the temple built by Solomon. In the garden, there was the tree of life, and in the tabernacle and temple, there was a 7-branched candelabra, the menorah, which likely represented the tree of life. In other words, the tabernacle was a replica of that original sanctuary in Eden. Even their orientation was the same. The front door of the garden faced east. That's the direction that Adam and Eve were driven out on the east side of the garden. And the front doors of the tabernacle and the temple, guess which direction they faced? They too faced east. One final connection, though, I want to mention before kind of putting all the pieces together here. When Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, God placed a cherub with a flaming sword at the entrance to guard the way to the tree of life. The tabernacle featured cherubim throughout its design as well, such as on the Ark of the Covenant. And Solomon took this even further. The temple had cherubim on the doors of the temple, the front doors, which faced east. So and also he had 2 large cherubim inside the most holy place, and their wings touched the wall across from each other. And he had cherubim and palm trees and flowers carved all throughout the walls, all symbolizing the Garden of Eden. So now back to Joshua. When Joshua crossed the Jordan and crossed into Canaan from the east, there in the book of Joshua, who did Joshua meet but the commander of the Lord's armies with a sword drawn in his hand? Now, was this the cherubim with the flaming sword guarding the entrance? I would say it is. Now, notice also what he tells Joshua there in Joshua 5:15. The commander of the Lord's army says to Joshua, "Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." Okay, so hopefully you can see how these pieces are all falling into place. If this land was Eden, the original Eden, the first sanctuary where God and man dwelled together, that it means what? That the conquest of Canaan, and this is the second thing I think will be helpful, the conquest of Canaan was the cleansing of that land, or the cleansing and the purging of the original sanctuary. And that sort of helps us understand better why God is so angry with the inhabitants of this land, okay? It means that the Canaanites were essentially contaminating the land. They were committing wicked deeds there. Now, they were very wicked. They weren't these innocent people sometimes we think of. We think of all these just innocent people dying just because they didn't worship the right God. Well, it's so much worse than that. They were very wicked. They were committing all kinds of pagan acts. But it wasn't just simply that they were committing pagan acts and wicked acts. They were doing it in God's backyard or his front yard. They were doing it on his property. That's why the angel says to Joshua, "You're standing on holy ground." And that's why their sin was extremely serious. This also explains why Abraham was going throughout Canaan and erecting altars to the Lord. He was going to these pagan hotspots, to like these various places where they would see special trees where certain pagan rituals would take place. And he was going there and he was building an altar to the Lord. And what he was doing was reintroducing Yahweh worship, true worship, in the land of Canaan. But remember what else God promised: that all nations would be blessed through Abraham's seed. Look back once more to Eden. God planted the garden in Eden and then put the man in it to work it. And that is really, the intention was that the garden would spread and would cover the world, and that they would be fruitful and multiply, increase, and fill the earth, so that the whole earth would be covered with the knowledge of the Lord, and so that his image would be multiplied throughout it, and the whole earth would become his kingdom. So, essentially, to put it another way, God's design was to make the whole earth his kingdom. And this is still his purpose even today, and the very reason that our Lord Jesus Christ came into the world. And this leads me to the third thing. The third thing, that the Canaanites had opportunities to repent, to avoid destruction. So, yeah, it might be troubling to think of them marching into Canaan and bringing destruction upon them and even death to even little ones. Yes, even little children were being killed. That's hard to understand. But think about when Joshua sends out the spies. If you haven't read it yet, you will. He sends the spies out, and they come back and they say the inhabitants are melting in fear of them. See, they had heard the reports of the Red Sea event and of their victory over other kingdoms. They know that no one can stand up against them because God is on their side. And so when they hear that the two spies had entered Jericho, when the leadership of Jericho hears this, they were very, very worried and terrified and wanted to try to find those men to put a stop to it. If they had repented, if they had sought refuge in the God of Israel, would they have been spared? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, Rahab is evidence of this, that she believed that the God of Israel was greater than all the gods of the Canaanites. And she sought refuge in the God of Israel. And she was spared. Her and her family, her household. Because and the spies told her, bring your family into your house, because only your house is going to be spared. And they were. So she sought refuge in the God of Israel. And Joshua 6:25 tells us, and she has lived in Israel to this day, because she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. It's not that she was spared because of works, but because of faith. She believed that the God of Israel was the true God, and that there was nothing that anyone could do to stop God's purposes from being fulfilled. Now, for your discussion, for some reflection, let me ask two questions. First, what do you understand the life to come to be like? This really does, I think, influence our thinking of the life to come, of the new heavens and the new earth. Do you see it, the new heavens and new earth, as some sort of ethereal, non-physical existence? Or do you really understand it to be the restoration of this very creation? Do you see God destroying everything in the physical world and causing us to just sort of float up to heaven as disembodied ghosts? Or do you see him restoring creation even beyond its original pre-fall glory? I would encourage you then to look at Revelation 21, verses 1 through 4. And there's other places in Revelation as well that sort of touch on this, but particularly those verses there show us sort of the reversal of everything that happens in Genesis. But also, the second question would be this. How is the church's mission to the world similar to Israel's conquest of Canaan? Read the job description of David's sons in Psalm 72, and there you will see a broader vision of David's son ruling the world from sea to sea. This idea that after they entered Canaan, that the kingdom would spread and grow across the whole world. And so note that broader vision of David's son ruling from sea to sea there in Psalm 72:8. Also look at Numbers 14:21. Look at Luke chapter 2 verse 14, and also Acts 1:8 as references for how we should understand our role as Christians in the world. Think about how these verses might deepen our understanding of the work of Christ to bring restoration and healing to all creation, and also to broaden our understanding of the Great Commission. That's all I have for today. So may God bless your reading in His Word.